Dina is a senior art history major with a minor in museum studies. The title of Dina's presentation is Restitution or Reframing, Returning Sacred Objects and Moral Accountability at the Vatican. So please welcome Dina.
Good afternoon. Thank you guys for coming out and hearing about the research all three of us have been doing. What does it mean to return something that was never freely given? And who gets to decide whether that return is an act of justice or an act of generosity? My name is Dina Flores, and today I will be presenting my thesis, Restitution or Reframing, Returning Sacred Objects and Moral Accountability at the Vatican. I explore how the Vatican's restitution of indigenous sacred objects sits at the intersection of moral accountability, institutional authority, and historical interpretation. In recent years, restitution became a major issue in art history, museum studies, and heritage work more broadly. In the past, these conversations focused mostly on ownership, who legally holds an object, and where it came from. But today, restitution asks a much deeper question. It forces restitution to confront how these objects were collected, why they were removed, and how they've been interpreted ever since. So before going further, I want to briefly define what I mean by restitution. At its simplest, restitution is the process of returning cultural objects to the communities they were taken from, often under condition of colonialism, conflict, or unequal power. Modern restitution debates were also shaped by responses to Nazi-era art looting, particularly through international agreements in the late 20th century. And this just isn't happening in one place, it's a global issue. The United States has passed laws like the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, known as NAGPRA, which requires museums to return certain cultural items. However, even laws like NAGPRA have limitations. For example, only federal recognized tribes can file claims, leaving many communities without access to restitution. In France, debates around the return of African objects, especially the Benin bronzes, have led to major policy changes and high-profile restitutions. And one of the most important shifts in this conversation is this. Cultural objects are no longer understood as neutral artifacts. They are part of living systems of knowledge, law, belief, and responsibility that were disrupted through colonial collecting practices. These particular objects come from indigenous communities in the Northwest Coast and Arctic regions of Canada. And this brings us to the Vatican's recent return of indigenous objects to Canada. These returns followed by Pope Francis's 2022 visit and apology to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities that were initiated in 2025. These objects originally entered Vatican collections through Catholic missionaries working in indigenous communities, especially during the 19th and earliest 20th centuries. Now, it's important to acknowledge that this history is complex. Some missionaries were directly involved in systems that disrupted indigenous cultures and contributed to the removal of sacred objects. But others believed they were preserving cultural practices that they thought were at risk of disappearing, and in some cases developed close relationships with indigenous communities. So this isn't just about individual intent. It's about larger systems of power, collection, and interpretation. Today, these objects are in the process of being returned, but the process is still ongoing and in some ways contested. All 62 items have been transferred to the Canadian Museum of History in Quebec in December of 2025, where they were still currently being held while indigenous leaders and experts work to determine their exact community of origin.
The initial transfer from the Vatican was made to the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops, which was acted as a formal legal recipient. However, this was intended as a temporary step to facilitate the return to Indigenous oversight. This step was not without controversy. Some Indigenous leaders raised concerns about the church acting as an intermediary rather than the objects being returned directly to communities. This concern becomes even more significant when we look at how the Vatican describes this transfer. As recently as March 2026, Indigenous leaders, including National Chief Cindy Woodhouse, participated in the formal uncrating of several of these items. At the museum, the objects are not part of the permanent collection, but they are being held in trust, meaning the museum provides secure storage, but does not claim ownership. And this process is essential because the goal is not just to return the objects to a country, but to return them to their specific communities of origin. As a result, access to these objects is currently restricted. They are not generally on public display unless permission is given by the Indigenous organizations overseeing the process. And eventually the goal is for these objects to be returned to their rightful custodians. To understand how these objects ended up in the Vatican in the first place, we need to go back a century. Many of them were originally taken to Rome for the 1925 Vatican Missionary Exposition. The 1925 Vatican Missionary Exposition, initiated under Pope Pius XIV, brought together over 100,000 objects collected by Catholic missionaries from around the world. These included items gathered by groups such as the Jesus, Oblates, the Marian Old Father, and many who were looking into Indigenous communities. While these objects were often described at the time as gifts, scholars today understand them as part of the broader colonial collecting practices, sometimes including items produced under coercive conditions such as residential schools. After the exhibition, many of these objects were absorbed into what is now known as the Vatican Ethnographic Collection, where they remained for nearly 100 years. So from the very beginning, these objects were not just collected. They were interpreted and framed through institutional narratives. And that framing doesn't end in the past. It continues today. Not through display alone, but also through language. But what's especially important is how the Vatican describes these returns. Instead of calling them restitution, official statements use terms like gifting, dialogue, and ecclesial sharing. So this raises a key question that guides my thesis. Does calling restitution a gift acknowledge injustice, or does it reframe the return in a way that preserves institutional authority? In this presentation, I argue that the Vatican's restitution operates in two ways at once. It corrects past removals, but at the same time, its language reframes restitution as generosity rather than accountability. To explore this, out of the 62 returned objects, we are going to focus on two: an Inuvi Alu kayak and a Kwak ancestral mask. Let's start with the mask. The Kwak are Indigenous peoples of the northwest coast of Canada, primarily located in what is now British Columbia. They are made up of several related communities who share cultural practices, language traditions, and systems of governance rooted in kinship and ancestry. In Kwak culture, social identity, status, and authority are closely tied to lineage, meaning connections to ancestors are not just symbolic, but actively maintained through ceremony and performance. As scholars like Franz Boas and more recent Indigenous researchers have shown, ceremonial practices, especially the potlatch, are central to how knowledge, rights, and responsibilities are passed down across generations. So when we look at these maps, it's important to understand that they exist within a system of law, history, and spiritual beliefs, not just artistic production. Among the Kwakwaka'wakw, these masks are not simply artwork. They are understood as living ancestral beings. They are activated through ceremony, performance, and inherited responsibility. Their meaning depends on movement, sound, and even who is allowed to see them. A close visual and material analysis, which is an examination of the object's physical form, materials, and construction, reveals the inadequacy of Western interpretations and highlights the true complexity of these masks. The Kwakwaka'wakw masks are typically carved from cedar wood, painted with bold pigments, and constructed with articulate elements that allow the transformation during performance. Many are designed as transformation masks, incorporating hinges and cords that enable the outer form to open and reveal an interface, materializing shifts between human and spirit realms. And this is key. The mask is not meant to sit still. Its meaning emerges through performance. Removed from context and placed within museum collections, the mask is reduced to its formal qualities of color, composition, and craftsmanship. And what gets lost is its ceremonial and relational meaning. As art historian Michael Boxendale reminds us, meaning depends on how and where we view something, and museums fundamentally change those conditions. To understand this more fully, we can look at what's called an object biography, which is the life of an object over time. For the Kwakwaka'wakw masks, they are passed down through families and used in potlatch ceremonies. A potlatch is not just a celebration, it is also a system of governance. It's where families affirm status, transfer rights, and maintain relationships across generations. To understand the potlatch a little better, this next slide will give us an idea of what a potlatch ceremony entails. In this particular one, it is celebrating and honoring the new name that this chief was given. When these masks enter into museum collections, their biography is disrupted. Many masks were collected during periods when potlatch ceremonies were suppressed under Canadian law. Placed behind glass and labeled for public viewing, these sacred objects are reclassified as artifacts and displayed in ways that ignore cultural protocols. And this aligns with art historian Laura Jane Smith's concept of authorized heritage discourse, where the elite institutions monopolize the definition of heritage while marginalizing indigenous perspectives. And this wasn't limited to just Canada. Missionary collecting was happening across the Americas, Africa, and beyond, feeding into major institutional collections, including the Vatican. So display itself becomes an act of power. What was once a living presence becomes a spectacle. And in missionary context, masks were often framed as evidence of pre-Christian beliefs, rather than recognized as sacred objects. So the mask shows us something important. Restitution isn't just about returning objects, it's also about confronting the systems that changed their meaning. While the mask highlights issues of visibility and display, the NUV Alawi kayak shows us how institutions can restore knowledge embedded in practice. The kayak is far more than a functional tool. It is a highly specialized technological object shaped by generations of environmental knowledge, social practice, and survival in Arctic conditions. It's made from materials like driftwood, bone, sealskin, and even human hair. And its design reflects a deep understanding of water, weather, and animal behavior. A formal and material analysis of the kayak reveals the sophistication of its construction. The lightweight frame offers a perfect balance of efficiency, but that doesn't tell the whole story, because the design comes from knowledge passed down through cultural practice. Within the Inuvi Alawi culture, the kayak is also an extension of the body. It's custom built to fit the hunter, allowing the movement, survival, and connection to the environment. This particular kayak is a highly specialized example because it was built for the pursuit of beluga whales. But once it enters the museum, it becomes an artifact, just something to look at. As anthropologist James Clifford explained, museums remove objects from their original context and reorganize them into institutional narratives. So the kayak becomes static. Its material form is emphasized while its knowledge systems are suppressed. But indigenous perspectives challenge this directly. During restitution processes, these objects have been described not as artifacts, but as our ancestors and our relatives, emphasizing their continued presence within systems of cultural and relational relationships. The kayak itself has been described as possessing a form of life or awareness, highlighting its role as an active participant in cultural life. As one representative pictured here explains, these objects are part of who we are. The return is about restoring relationships, not possessions. So here restitution becomes a form of interpretive repair. It restores the condition that allows the meaning to exist. So the kayak reinforces the key idea. Restitution is not only a material act, it is also an interpretive one. It challenges how objects were classified and who has the authority to define their meaning. Building on these object histories, we can now look at how interpretation operates not just through display, but also through language. In an official statement, the Vatican describes these returns as acts of gifting, dialogue, and ecclesial sharing. The official 2025 statement release reads, at the conclusion of the journey initiated by Pope Francis, Pope Leo XIV desires that this gift represent a concrete sign of dialogue, respect, and fraternity. This is an act of ecclesial sharing, with which the successor of Peter entrusts to the Church in Canada these artifacts, which bear witness to the history of the encounter between faith and the cultures of the indigenous people. At first glance, this sounds positive, focused on respect and reconciliation. But if we look more closely through what's called discourse analysis, which is the study of how language shapes meaning and power, we start to see something else. Words like gift and sharing frame restitution as voluntary and generous, rather than a response to historical dispossession. Calling it a gift shifts the narrative away from accountability. And the term entrusted is also important. Rather than returning objects directly to indigenous communities, the Vatican positions itself as transferring them to the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops as ecclesiastical intermediaries. This language suggests care and responsibility, but it also implies that the institution still maintains a degree of control over the restitution. And as scholars like Cody Grote point out, this allows institutions to maintain a degree of control within the restitution process. Another scholar, Gloria Bell, has raised concerns about what she describes as a false narrative of the gift, pointing out that many of these objects were not freely given. So in this case, the Vatican's language emphasizes reconciliation while downplaying historical injustice. This shows us that restitution is not just material, it is also narrative. Through language, institutions can reshape how restitution is understood. And this raises a question about Christian ethics and institutional responsibility. Christian teachings emphasize justice and reconciliation, but those values only matter if they don't override indigenous sovereignty. For indigenous communities, restitution is not symbolic. It's about continuity, responsibility, and authority. So ethical restitution requires more than returning objects. It requires acknowledging how they were taken and who has the right to define their meaning. But the The Vatican's language of gifting shows how those same systems continue to shape how restitution is understood today. Without acknowledging these deeper ties, returning objects risks becoming only a transfer of property, leaving the relationships and responsibilities that sustain their meaning unresolved. Rather than rejecting Christian values, this critique calls for them to be taken seriously. If Christian ethics emphasize justice, accountability, and reconciliation, then religious institutions should be held to an even higher standard than secular ones in how they approach restitution. So I want to return to the question I began with, but slightly shifted. If most of these objects were never freely given, can they truly be given back? And if restitution is described as a gift, is it really a return? Or is it a kind of regifting? And ultimately, if these objects are living presences embedded in systems of law, belief, and responsibility, what do we owe them? And who has authority to decide whether this return is an act of generosity or an obligation to justice? Thank you.